Welcome to another episode of VNture podcast, your weekly source of visual novel goodness. I am Emar, and together with Tauros we shall venture into another discussion about VNs. Today we have a pleasure to talk with a YouTuber and essayist, proficient in analyzing our favorite media to such a detail that makes my mind spin. Welcome to the podcast, Adze.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. As MR said, my name is Adze, and I am a video essayist. I mostly talk about visual novels, but I occasionally branch out into any other form of weeb media or JRPGs.
And I know a lot of us, a lot of visual novel readers also like to dabble in those sorts of visual novel adjacent hobbies, like you mentioned, video games, JRPGs, anime, light novels, whatnot. So, honestly, I've always appreciated content creators who don't just limit themselves to one genre or medium. So I always appreciate that. Yeah, that's pretty cool. The first thing that I wanted to ask you is that you do call yourself literary. Let me see. Is that you label your videos as video essays, and I wanted to ask you what that meant to you specifically.
Well, video essay can encompass a pretty wide variety of content, but essentially, if you're scripting a video and you're doing voiceover and you have a general message you want to convey, and for me, it tends to be reviews or media analysis, but it can be called documentaries, there's retrospectives, all sorts of things. Essentially, if you're doing something that could reasonably be considered an essay and just making a video about it, I'd say that qualifies.
Because a lot of the videos you put out tend to be very analytical. They're usually like 20 to 40 minutes long, and you really break down the various elements of it. And you also really like going into the story beats and themes, right?
Yeah, that's just, my brain kind of just makes the happy chemicals when I think about that stuff, so that's what I tend to focus on.
Oh, totally. Especially for something as story-rich as a visual novel. I think a lot of times people appreciate the visuals and the writing. But as for my personal preference, I really like to dig into the story and the plot beats it follows and the themes and the twists and the characterizations. So it takes a lot of effort, and sometimes I go down the wrong track of where I think a story's headed. But do you ever analyze a visual novel while you're playing it, or is that something like you reserve putting together a video until after you finish a product?
Well, what you see in a video is ultimately my thoughts after having finished it. As I'm reading something, I'm always kind of thinking about things. My brain's just kind of going on autopilot, wondering, this is an interesting observation, or I wonder what they're going to do with this. But it doesn't all come together until afterwards.
Because on one hand, you've got MR who takes 1 million screenshots while he's playing something, right? And as for me, it's I try not to, because on the one hand, I do want to enjoy it in the moment, but at the same time, I also want to be where's this building to? And it's I'm trying to think about, characterization and stuff, but then I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Yeah, well, I think with a good story, it can usually allow you to think about those things and not take away from it.
That's true. But speaking of videos, what have you been up to lately? What have you uploaded recently? What are you working on? Anything like that?
Well, lately, I have been, as I've mentioned in my community post, I've been pretty busy since I have gone back to school, and I am still working a full-time job, so together that leaves me with not a whole lot of free time. So lately, I've been kind of stepping away a bit from the really long, in-depth stuff, and just kind of experimenting a bit. I released a video just talking about every visual novel I've read. I went out and picked the lowest ranked visual novel on VNDB and reviewed that, and just, kind of playing around with that.
Oof. Well, I mean, hey, congrats on your life, and I hope everything goes smoothly with that. It can't be easy, huh?
It's not as bad as it could be. It's just, big time commitment.
Let me express we appreciate you took the time to join us here today, despite your busy schedule. And now we have an opportunity to talk about what makes those happy juices flow in your mind. For example, something that always intrigued me with your analytical videos in how you approach those titles. And you seem to enjoy deciphering a feedback loop of how the world affects the story and how the story affects the world. Where did it start? Did it start with VNs? Because looking back at your channel, you did not start with VNs specifically, but did analysis started with those?
Well, yeah, I haven't actually been a big visual novel reader for all that long. I would say, about 2020 is when I really started getting into them. And I mean, I've always kind of had a bit of an analytical mind. I was a book reader for my entire life, and and I just enjoyed media in general. And of course, I fell into gaming at a very young age. And with YouTube, I kind of started out wanting to almost do like a game maker's toolkit kind of thing, but a little bit less technical and more big picture. And so I'm not even sure what videos are still up on the of my oldest stuff, but a lot of that was kind of focusing on an idea in game design. And as my content evolved, eventually I started to really like visual novels, and I'm just like, oh, I'm talking about this now, I guess.
You mentioned on another podcast that you stumbled upon a certain visual novel that tends to be a good starting point for a lot of people. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this is like a great story. I never get tired of telling it. So I need to preface this by saying that growing up, I was about as removed from anime culture as you could possibly be without like actively pushing it away. Basically, I watched the Pokemon anime, a few episodes of that as a kid, because everyone my age has. But aside from that, I was just never really exposed to it. But, I got into gaming and internet culture. And one day I was browsing somewhere, I couldn't even tell you where, and I saw somebody reference the cripple dating sim made by 4chan. I'm just like, oh yeah, this has got to be the dumbest bullshit I can imagine. I'm going to play it. That was Katawa Shoujo. And I realized about 20 minutes in, oh, this isn't a joke. Even though there's sexist Harry Potter, it's actually a serious project. So I continued reading it, and I fell in love with it. And then from there, I was much more open to reading visual novels. I learned what the phrase visual novel even meant. And, a few years later, I just kind of dove headfirst and got really into them.
One of us.
Yep, oh my goodness, Katawa Shoujo was a huge gateway VN for all sorts of people, and I always am happy to hear of the people who jumped in thinking it was going to be a dumpster fire, and then realized their love for visual novels. Those sorts of stories always make me happy too. Back then,
sometimes I wonder what would have happened if it was actually just a massive shitpost. Like, how would things have changed?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, for one thing, you probably still would be removed from all sorts of anime stuff, right?
Yeah, probably.
And on the big picture, we might not even have the Western visual novel scene as it is today. That's something to think of. But speaking of which, on a different note, I think your most popular video is actually a review of every Toho game, which is pretty darn far into the weeb stuff. As far as weeb video games and animes and hobby stuff goes, it's the Toho series. How did you get introduced into that?
Well, the thing is, So that video was made, before I was really that much into anime stuff. And I mean, you may not be able to tell now, but I probably about 300 subscribers at the time I released that video. And despite not being like really weeb, Toho does kind of infest a lot of culture. Like there's a lot of stuff you can recognize from them. A lot of the character designs are pretty iconic. And of course there's the music. Everybody has heard the music, even if they think they haven't. And on top of that, the bullet hell genre, it is kind of defined by Toho. Of course, there are other bullet hell series out there, but Toho is the big one. So eventually, I kind of was like, I kind of want to see what this is all about, what this Toho thing is. But I also just really did not know where to start. Because at the time, there were, I think, 17 games plus spin-offs. And that's just the official games. So I decided, you know what? It would be kind of cool to just go through the entire series, start to finish, just, it would make good content. So that's what I did. I was able to find them all, and it kind of just eliminated that problem of I don't know where to start. And yeah.
Wow. That's a huge time investment. That's a lot of content.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't play a whole lot of each game. I think I played about an hour or two of each. Which, I mean, that's not nothing, but it's not like I was mastering each game before moving on to the next.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
Did that experience or rather approach to the entire series make it less of a daunting task of taking on a visual novel that is lengthy and serious to tackle? Because some of those you have ongoing, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will say that with the Toho video specifically, the fact that I was only spending, the fact that it's so broken up, because, everybody looks at it and sees, an hour-long video. But for me, it was, about 20 sections of a couple minutes each.
Okay.
So it even though it did take me a long time to do, it didn't feel like all that long. And compare it to some of my other content, even like ones that are only like 40 minutes, or that ungodly 2-hour video I did. Those are a lot less broken up, so they actually feel longer to make sometimes.
Which 2-hour video?
I was on Shining Song Star Nova.
Shining Song Star Nova. That's an OELVN, right?
It is, although you'd be forgiven for not noticing that if you just go in blind. But yes, it is OELVN.
Yeah, why is that? Why did you say that?
Well, I would say it's definitely designed to emulate a Japanese visual novel, I think.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Because I mean, I've actually like read some of, I've experienced most of that company, Love and Space's work, and it's mostly headed up by one guy. So I kind of learned a little bit of his story just through reading the director's notes on one of his older projects, and he's been moving around several countries when he was younger, including Japan and Korea, I think, and the US. So I'm sure he was kind of immersed in that culture at least a little bit from a very young age, despite being, a native English speaker. So I think when he eventually made his own big serious projects, they kind of, took after what was already out there, which was mainly Japanese stuff.
Mm-hmm. And to be fair, that's what a lot of OELVNs do, actually. They try to emulate that style because that's what most people are familiar with and associate with visual novels. But you mentioned that he's as actual real life experience in those places, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of his older works, Homeward, the story is essentially about his, it's about the same struggles he dealt with as a child. When you move from country to country, you don't really have a home. So, Homeward. And yes, so it was an interesting look into his mind. I don't think any of his other works since have been quite as personal as that one, but it really does help me to kind of see where he's coming from when he writes.
Oh my goodness, that's actually, it's not just a 2-hour video on Shining Song Star Nova, it's a detailed character analysis.
Yes.
Oh wow. So like you actually focused and went in depth into all of their personalities and whatnot.
Yeah. I didn't do side characters though.
Do you think was that easier or harder than like a general visual novel review?
I would say harder, mainly because, I mean, for starters, it took me so long to do that video. Like, I can still like get like flashbacks of sitting down and writing up that script, getting into a groove, and then realizing, oh, I've just done most of the way through one section out of 7. So it was very satisfying to have it done, but there were definitely moments of misery while I was making it.
That is the classic content creator experience, huh?
Oh yeah.
Thankfully,
I mean,
yeah.
I was saying, just ask any YouTuber. They'll say they really like making content, but like when they're editing, they want to die.
Mm-hmm. And that's all kept out of sight from the audience and the viewers. They just get to see the awesome finished product.
Yes.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, but the same can be said about developers that develop games, right? So, yeah, but I understand. As for the Love in Space, I read the Shining Song Star Nova. It was actually pretty interesting because I thought I wouldn't vibe with the title that talks about idol culture, but the way they told the story was super intriguing. That was, yeah, it left a mark in me. And I have the second series. They have the Sunrider, I think it's called.
Yes.
They recently released the 4th title, I guess.
They call it the 4th, but I think it's the 3rd. Because they kind of bundled the first 2 together into the same piece of software. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of OEL VNs, there's one that you recently talked about that you really liked and you praised quite a bit called Greener Pastures. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so one of my guilty pleasures is I really like those, shitty adult dating sims. Like, they're just the perfect thing after a long day at work to just put on, and just they're generally very corny. They have a lot of dumb humor in it, and you don't really have to think while you're playing them. So that was one of those. I saw it, I'm like, oh, building a Monster Girl harem? That sounds stupid. I'm in. And then I started reading it, and after a while I realized, holy shit, this is actually pretty good. Like, first of all, the protagonist was like an actual character. He wasn't just a self-insert, which is something I really appreciate in stories. And, a lot of visual novels tend to do the self-insert thing rather than having a real character. I also noticed that the characters themselves were also very good. It's one of the few titles I've seen with a tsundere I actually like. And they also had, like, literally the healthiest BDSM dynamic in any piece of media I've ever seen to date.
Oh, wow. Usually you see those, dynamics and they just, it's a very shallow, stereotypical look. But you said this one actually had one that was very well represented?
Yeah, it's basically, like, the thing is, I'm not really into that kind of thing, but I do think it's, like, important to have a working knowledge of it, just so if you're ever in a situation where that comes up, you know how to be safe and how everybody's, like, on the same page and all that. So, like, I learned a bit, and I've known people who were in that lifestyle. And, one thing is they're very, very on top of being safe, making sure everybody's on board with everything, and communication and all that. And you do not see that represented in visual novels, but really any adult media, except here.
Ooh, okay, very interesting. And You also said there was a tsundere character that you actually liked.
Yeah, I know it's a controversial statement for some, but I generally just find tsunderes annoying, and it's like the joke I always put in my videos is I can't understand why I'm supposed to like the character whose defining personality trait is bitch. So it's just tsunderes just don't really gel with me, but this was an exception.
And why was that? Was it like a more realistic character outlook or the plot involvements?
I think part of it is that there are kind of two elements to that. Firstly, the transition to actually becoming like a more likable character happens pretty quickly. Like I would say there's like a few scenes of the character being kind of hostile, and then as they kind of open up to the protagonist, then they start to become nicer. And also, they keep a lot of the tsundere personality traits, but in a positive way. So like rather than being like mean and lashing out at people, they're just, a little snarky and a little mischievous. So it still felt like the same character, but actually like likable.
So they just accelerated the Dara, as to say.
Yeah, they went from
Huh.
tsundere pretty quickly.
Okay.
Never gonna complain about that.
True.
Yes.
I have a question though. How, given that you like to analyze and you like to think through what you're reading, how was the title for no thinking required a thing for you to get a guilty pleasure for? And how did you enjoy it? Is because you could turn your brain off, or maybe because you did actually think about it and it was deeper than it seemed?
I mean, it depends on my state of mind when I'm gonna be booting something up. Like, despite the fact that I like to analyze stuff, I am also capable of enjoying things that are just pure dumb entertainment. And I mean, I went into something like Greener Pastures expecting just dumb fun. It's like why you'd see a Michael Bay movie is for all the explosions. But I got into it and then realized there was actually something serious there. And then I started liking it for an entirely different reason. And
Uh-huh.
that it's just it's hard to say. Like once I get hooked on something, then I'm kind of on board until the end. I mean, even if I did kind of get bait and switched in that way, but it all worked out in the end, and I'm happy with it.
Okay, but now I have a different question. What made you decide to make a video about it? And does that video meet your criteria of essay? You mentioned before that it takes a structure and a message to convey.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's because once I finished it, my brain was still kind of going a mile a minute. Like there was
Okay.
things like I had the brain worms, and that's something that happens with certain pieces of media. I'll consume that media, and then I'll just be like really, really anxious to talk about it in some form, which sometimes it takes the form of like a Twitter thread, and sometimes it takes the form of a video. And with that one, I'm like, this was good. And it was like way better than it had any right to be. I was just like, yeah, I want to talk about that. And I would say it's a video essay. It's, I again, I don't really have like these hard and fast definitions for it. I just think it's like a good general term to kind of explain what I do. But yeah, this was, I took a few core ideas that I liked from Greener Pastures and just expanded on it a bit.
And you generally avoid spoilers too in these videos, right?
It depends. Like some of them, if I'm doing like a full in-depth breakdown, then I will do spoilers, although I'll usually try to have a section that is spoiler free just so people can at least enjoy some of the video if they don't want to get spoiled. But for these shorter videos, the ones where I'm just kind of going over something rather than digging deep into it, those I usually try to avoid major spoilers.
I mean, this is probably a big dilemma. You ultimately cannot analyze that deeply and avoid spoilers at the same time, right?
Generally speaking, yes. Sometimes there are aspects of a story that you can dig into without spoilers, but oftentimes it's not possible.
But, so that's an OELVN. And
Mhm.
what are your thoughts about the Western OELVN scene as a whole? You mentioned that usually you want to find these as just cheap, crappy, ways to pass the time that you don't have to put much thought into. And to be fair, there are lots of them. Is that what you think of the whole, I guess you could say the whole VN scene in the West as a whole, or what?
I don't know. I feel like a lot of the OELVN industry, if you want to even call it that, it's still very much in its infancy, in my opinion. Like, even visual novels in Japan started out as porn games. So I feel like it's going through a growing pains right now. I mean, there's obviously some that are emulating Japanese style visual novels, which I would say a lot of those tend to be of a pretty decent quality. But a lot of the other ones, that use the 3D models or that are made in like Koikatsu or some of the other ones that are not coming to my head at the moment. I think there's some good stuff there. There's a lot of cheap porn out there, and I just think it's one of those things that's gonna look very interesting in 5 years.
I do agree there's a lot of indie content out there, mostly because when you compare the Japanese, Eastern side of the industry, you have these big AAA titles, and frankly, just over here in the West, you don't have those AAA, studios putting that much money into a visual novel. Like, the closest you'd get to that is like the Telltale games, which are more associated with like choose your own adventure more than anything as sort of a medium for reading primarily.
Yeah, well, I think the Telltale stuff, even though I have my issues with Telltale, like for me, I don't like how little the choices matter in those games, even though they try to pretend that they do. But I think Telltale showed that there is a market in the West for interactive media that focuses on the story almost to the exclusion of gameplay. So, like, I think visual novels could eventually have a place here in the West in the general culture. And the one thing I do hope is that I would like to see more non-anime visual novels like that actually have a lot of time and effort put into them, and maybe eventually get like studios to actually do them, because there's really nothing about the visual novel medium that requires it to be anime. And I wouldn't mind seeing some diversity there.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Now that you mentioned the tendency to emulate anime, one developer in particular came to mind, and this is a title that Tauros read, The Letter, a developer I did uncover during the Kickstarter campaign for Love Esquire, a young mobile. They do an interesting job for their titles, and with Love Esquire being a very, in my opinion, well-budgeted title with interesting twist on a hero's journey, when you weren't really the hero as in the knight that defends the kingdom, but you were the squire to the knight who were defending the kingdom. That was the twist. And they recently released Saintsmaker, which tends to lower down the anime-ness, let's say. And with regard to that, I think you might find it interesting how they try to explore the non-anime variants. And again, when it comes to The Letter, Taurus is more knowledgeable that title.
Yeah, I was actually about to mention The Letter too, so we had the same thought at the same time, Amar.
Yeah, speaking about the brainworms earlier.
Although it's also another interesting aspect of people who mentioned the anime side, is that where exactly does the line of anime art style begin, and where does it end? because, you know, obviously you're not going to see too many titles with like photorealistic graphics. You'd either have to use like live action for that or photographs or whatnot. So usually you have some element of stylization, right? But
True.
I feel, you know, but there is a difference between like the typical anime weebness of like Saku Saku Love Blooms in the Cherry Blossoms, where all the characters have like bright pastel hairs and giant eyes and everything's super kawaii. And then you have a difference between just, you know, other people drawing maybe more cartoony in a sense.
To contrast that with King of the Cul-de-Sac, we had Avimi on the podcast before, and that's his cartoonish style for visual novels he called graphic novels.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I guess differentiate from VNs, I guess.
Yep, so I mean, but so other people would still look at it and just see that it's, you know, sort of chibi-ish or, you know, stylized, and just write it off as the anime-ish or whatever. And other people, you know, like us and, you know, Vimy as well, would definitely recognize it as more of a, what did he mention, graphic novelist style?
Yeah.
Exactly, so then you get down into the breakdowns, and you start investigating the discrepancies between all of these, and a lot of the lines get fuzzy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be like a hard line between what's anime and what's not. I mean, even if you look at other mediums, like if you like traditional like cartoon animation, you know, there's stuff that's obviously, you know, anime, or if you look at like old Looney Tunes stuff, it actually looks old Looney Tunes and old Disney animations. They do look an awful lot like stuff that was produced in Japan at the time. Like they all take beats from one another. And I don't, and again, you're never going to get something that's definitely just, this is the stuff from that's Japanese, this is the stuff that's European, this is the stuff that's North American. But I wouldn't mind seeing stuff that kind of has its own visual identity. That's not just, let's make this look like it was made in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Katsuwa Shoujo did a great job of that.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have
Yeah,
a
well,
question.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, finish that thought, because
Yeah, well,
I'll
okay,
probably-
well, yeah. Well, I was thinking that Katsuwa Shoujo, while not being like overly anime, it definitely does have a lot of like anime to it. I mean, it was made by a bunch of weebs, and it's set in Japan, and all that stuff. And there are a few little jokes that you can see that, like, you know, like Misha has the bright pink hair, and then there's Kenji, who's the over the top crazy dude. Like, there's definitely some anime in there.
Yeah, with swirly glasses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to jump off from that topic of anime style to ask you about your approach to learning, because it takes quite a lot of knowledge and brain power, and I guess to some degree talent, to observe patterns or characteristics, I guess, in any fictional work, to see how it works and how to deconstruct it. Because, for example, you mentioned how RuneScape mirrors its economy from real world, right? So how do you approach learning to do those detailed analysis, so then you can comfortably say in your videos that you research pseudoscience in order to decipher Lovecraftian fatalist message with deterministic spin on non-deterministic concept of willpower affecting reality?
Well, I think a lot of learning when it comes to media analysis specifically, a lot of it just comes down to trying to be observant. And if something kind of sticks out, like, you can make a mental note about that and like think, I got to think through this a little bit more. And I think part of this is, you know, again, I've been reading since a very young age. I was always reading above my grade level, and because my parents got me reading when I was young, and I just kind of found that I enjoyed it, and I kept reading all the way throughout into my adulthood. So that was always like, consuming media was always a big part of my behavior. And even as I would play video games and later read visual novels, I would just notice little things. And once I started doing YouTube, it became like almost like my hobby to specifically talk about them. So it kind of forced me to think about them a little bit more than I otherwise would. And a lot of the things I notice only really comes out when I actively think about it. Like, what did I just consume? And what do I think about that? And over time, knowledge does accumulate. And especially when I watch a lot of YouTube videos myself. Sometimes I'll watch stuff on writing or even stuff on film, which a lot of the stuff does actually translate. And just over time, again, I've been doing this for a couple years now, and almost everything I say is built on knowledge I've acquired either from a past video or from another source, and it all just accumulates.
Huh. I mean, that's very interesting. With that being said, we reached the time limit for this episode. So, unfortunately, this comes to a close. But, to quote a saying from a title we all keep close to our hearts, when parting with a person, not wanting for it to be the last time you see them, I won't say bye-bye. Instead, I'm going to say, see you later.
All right, well, I will see you later.
Yes, well, we'll see you next week, Adze. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast. Please let us know if you have any questions or thoughts or improvements. We'd love to hear it. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.